5 years later. "All right, keep your eyes peeled. I think we're getting close," said Jeff, pushing his cap back on his head and watching the street signs as they entered the town of Crystal Lake. He drove the midnight blue 4x4 with the raised body very slowly, being careful not to exceed the posted speed limit of 25 miles per hour. He had bought it for his 18th birthday after taking several years to save up enough money for the down payment. It was still brand new, not even 1,000 miles on it yet. He knew that a lot of these small towns boosted their revenues at the expense of tourists and vacationers coming through, city drivers who were accustomed to a faster pace and therefore had a hard time driving slowly in the country. His father had co-signed the loan on the condition that he keep a clean driving record, and Jeff intended to hold up his end of the bargain. Beside him, Sandra, a pretty 17-year-old blonde, checked the directions she had scrawled on a piece of loose-leaf paper. She glanced up, looking through the windshield, brushing her thick, curly hair out of her eyes as she checked for landmarks. "Hey, there's the gas station," she said, recognizing one. Jeff pulled over to the curb across the street from the gas station. "Come on, let's call Ted," he said, opening the door. Ted had told them to get to the service station in town and call him from there so he could come out and meet them. Otherwise, he warned them, they'd only get hopelessly confused. "You can get lost on those little back roads," he had told them. "Believe me, I know. Just give me a call from the Gulf station when you get into town and I'll come out and get you. You can't miss it. Just look for the big old orange sign." Jeff and Sandra ran across the street to the phone booth in the gas station. Jeff fished around in the pockets of his jeans until he found a quarter. He deposited it and dialed Ted's number. Sandra put her hands in the pockets of her khaki hiking shorts and took a look around at the town of Crystal Lake. Ted had been right when he had told them that there wasn't much to see. "Oh, it's just a little old hick town," he had said. "But what the hell, it's home, right?" Actually, it was only a summer home that belonged to Ted's parents. Ted used to spend his vacations here, but recently his parents preferred to get away to Europe. Ted usually worked at counseling jobs at various camps, so the house in Crystal Lake was closed most of the year. It was on the market, but apparently there was no great rush to buy homes in this town. Looking around, Sandra thought she could understand why. The town looked dead. Still, the prospect of spending a couple of weeks at the counselor's training center, then having a big, empty house to play in for a few days before the summer camp season got started, seemed like a lot of fun. They might meet some nice people at this training thing, and then, when it was over, there'd be some time to party with them. She wondered what the director of the training center, Paul Holt, would be like. She hoped he wouldn't be a jerk. Ted had said he knew him from working with him several summers before. "Hey, Teddy buddy!" Jeff hollered into the phone. "We just rolled in." "Huh? Yeah, Sandra's here. You coming down to get us or what?" Jeff listened for a moment. Then he looked at her with a wry expression. After all the talk about picking them up in town and guiding them back to the training center to keep them from getting lost, now it seemed that Ted couldn't come and meet them after all. "Okay, give me directions," Jeff said with resignation. As he started scribbling them down, Sandra noticed an old man coming toward them, pushing an old bicycle. He looked like a real geek. His body was like a scarecrow's, and his face was grizzled with stubble. He wore a battered old felt hat and a dark green, stained work shirt with a ratty-looking vest and shapeless slacks. His bicycle looked almost as bad as he did. It looked as if he had picked it up from a trash heap. It was all rattly and rusty. The paint was chipped, and the handlebars were twisted. The fenders were rubbing on the wheels. The chain guard was loose, and the seat was worn clean through. As the old man came toward them, Sandra nudged Jeff to take a look at him. Jeff glanced at him quickly, grinned at her, then went back to listening to Ted. "Uh-huh. Right," he said, repeating the directions as he scribbled them down. "Out the North Road? Right after the first fork? Look for a Dairy Queen? Left over a covered bridge." The old man hesitated when he passed them, and a strange look came over his face. He glanced at Jeff, and then he looked at Sandra, his eyes glazing over as if he were listening to something no one else could hear. His name was Ralph, and he was the town crazy. No one ever paid any attention to him, except when he got drunk and careened around the town on his bicycle, preaching the gospel at the top of his lungs and threatening to veer out into traffic or crash through somebody's store window. He never seemed to make it around the corner of Harlan's hardware store, and he would inevitably smash into Harlan's front steps and wind up in a tangled heap pinned beneath his bike, writhing on the ground and screaming. Then someone would pay attention to him. Harlan would come running out and start jumping up and down and shouting at him, calling him names like sleazeball and egg sucker, and threatening to wrap that trashed-out bike around his scrawny neck. A crowd would usually gather, or as much of a crowd as you could get together in Crystal Lake, and the sheriff would have to come by and pull Harlan off Ralph and take Ralph down to the jail to dry out. It was always like that, the same routine. They paid attention to him when he had too much to drink, but they never paid attention to him when it really counted, when he tried to warn them. He had seen things out in the woods, and he knew what was going to happen if they started having kids out there again, if they started trespassing on his turf. Just like the last time, he thought, when he'd tried to tell them what would happen and they didn't listen.
"I told the others,"
Ralph said, his voice hollow and eerie, his eyes bulging wildly as he approached Sandra and Jeff with maniac intensity.
"They didn't believe me. You're all doomed."
Sandra backed away from him uneasily. Jeff did a double take, not sure how to react, but Ralph had already moved away. Jeff and Sandra exchanged glances, and Jeff sighed, rolled his eyes, and shook his head. "What?" he said, talking to Ted. "Oh, no. It was nothing. Go ahead." "Wait a minute, Ted. Slow down, okay? So, all right, covered bridge. I got that. Uh-huh. Then past an old cemetery." Sandra looked at the illegible way he was scrawling the directions and made a face. "We'll never find the place," she muttered, looking around. "Yeah, left," said Jeff. "Then half a mile farther on a dirt road." "Oh, my God," said Sandra, noticing for the first time the big black wrecker that had pulled up to their pickup truck. "They're towing us." Jeff spun around and saw that the driver of the wrecker already had the pickup hoisted and was walking toward the door, preparing to drive off. "Ted, I'll call you back," Jeff shouted into the receiver, and then dropped it, leaving it dangling as he ran with Sandra to the truck. "Hey!" he yelled as the truck driver started up the wrecker. "Hey, wait!" If the driver heard or saw them, he paid no attention. He shifted the wrecker into first and slowly pulled away, towing their pickup truck behind him. "Hey, stop!" shouted Jeff, chasing the wrecker. "It's my truck you're towing! Hey, asshole!" "You can't do this," Sandra cried, running hard to keep up with Jeff. "All our stuff's in there." Jeff caught up to the truck and started banging on the driver's window, but the man stared straight ahead with a deadpan expression. "Hey! Hey, asshole!" Jeff yelled, trying to stay even with the truck. The driver could easily have pulled away, but he continued on at a pace just fast enough to make Jeff and Sandra run hard to keep up, but not so fast as to leave them behind. He drove the wrecker off the main street and down a tree-lined residential avenue, speeding up a bit as Jeff and Sandra struggled to keep up. Then suddenly he pulled up in front of a large Victorian house and stopped. Jeff and Sandra came to a halt, out of breath, completely taken aback at the sight of Ted standing on the front lawn and grinning at them with his hands on his hips. "Welcome to God's country," Ted said, laughing. For a moment, both Jeff and Sandra stared at him. Then realization dawned, and they charged him, shaking and pummeling him playfully. "You rat shit," said Jeff. "You set us up." Ted laughed and waved to the driver of the wrecker, who was winching down their pickup and grinning at them. "Thanks, Max," said Ted. Max gave them a wink. "Max owns the station," Ted explained. "He's crazy, too." "I should have known," said Sandra, punching him on the shoulder. "It's great you guys could make it," Ted said, putting his arms around them. "It's going to be like old times." "That's what I'm afraid of," Jeff said, laughing. He remembered only too well what it had been like the summer they'd spent together before they went off to different schools. Ted hadn't changed at all. He was still as skinny as a beanpole. He still wore loud clothes like the yellow checked shirt he had on, and he still played practical jokes. "Come on, help me load my gear," said Ted. "We'll split for the camp." They helped Ted carry his pack and duffel bags to the pickup and tossed them in the back. Then they piled in and Ted directed them on the road through Crystal Lake and out of town. "So, what's the scoop?" said Jeff as they left town and headed down a winding country road that led toward the lake. Sandra sat between the two of them, watching the scenery and working the radio. Ted was hunched up against the door, his hand on the outside of the truck, drumming a beat in time to the music. "Well, I know the guy that runs the course," he said. "He's okay. Kind of macho, though, you know. He takes the whole thing very seriously. We'll probably all get a brownie badge to wear." He dropped his voice theatrically. "If we survive." "If we survive?" Sandra exclaimed, looking at Ted. "I didn't tell you," Ted said innocently. "I'm going to be his second assistant." "Oh, God!" Jeff and Sandra both said at once, rolling their eyes in mock horror. After a while, they turned off the country road and headed up a narrow, graded dirt road, leading back into the woods. It was barely wide enough for two vehicles to pass each other, even if they went very slowly and carefully. Ted was rattling off a series of bad jokes when Jeff came around a turn and slammed on the brakes. "So the bear wiped his ass with a rabbit." Sandra had to straight-arm the dashboard to keep from getting thrown forward, and Ted grabbed on to the window frame for support. "What the hell is that?" he said, looking out through the windshield. There was a large, dead tree limb blocking the road, but there weren't any trees on the side of the road big enough to have dropped a limb that size. There were just small pines and oaks and some scrub brush. "Where'd that sucker come from?" Jeff said, getting out of the truck. Ted let Sandra out and then slammed the door, coming around the front of the truck to examine the tree limb. It was too big to drive over. They'd wind up dragging it along with them if they tried, and Jeff wasn't about to risk ruining the undercarriage of his brand new truck. He stood there, staring at it and shaking his head. Ted shrugged and bent down to grasp the tree limb by a thick branch that was sticking up. He grunted as he tried to move it. It was a hell of a lot heavier than it looked. "Come on," he said to Jeff. "Give me a hand." It looks like somebody dragged it out here, Jeff said, pointing to some drag marks by the side of the road. As they both bent down to move the tree limb, Sandra wandered off the road and down a narrow path she'd spotted. She thought at first that it might be an animal run. She knew that dense woods were not the best place to look for wildlife because animals needed a greater variety of vegetation, like that found in clearings, near rivers and streams, and at the edge of forests. Animals were creatures of habit, and they commonly used the same routes, called trails and runs, to get to their feeding and watering areas. New ones were barely noticeable, being little more than pushed-down undergrowth that could easily escape a casual glance. Older ones had been trampled down often enough to kill some of the undergrowth and leave a narrow dirt path. Initially, Sandra thought she had spotted a very old run, because the path was well-traveled and worn in, deeper in the center than at the edges. At first she became excited, knowing there would be deer in this country, as well as bears. But on closer examination, as she walked a bit further into the woods, she realized that it wasn't an animal run after all. It was a path that had been worn by people, only it was becoming overgrown. She noticed a piece of white painted wood laying in some bushes and bent down to pick it up. "Hey, you guys," she called. "Take a look at this." Working together, Ted and Jeff had managed to heave the tree limb into the bushes. They jogged down the overgrown trail after her. Sandra stood looking down at the remains of an old sign. It was splintered at the edges, and the white paint was cracked and peeling. The faded black letters on it read, "Camp Crystal Lake." Ted exhaled softly. "Camp Blood," he said in a low voice. Jeff and Sandra both looked at him questioningly. "This place is on the same lake that we're going to be," Ted said, looking around uneasily. "Camp Blood?" said Jeff. Sandra stared at the sign, frowning. There was something familiar about that name, but she couldn't place it. It seemed to her that she had heard something about a place known as Camp Blood. She thought she could remember a newspaper article about some murders that had taken place at a summer camp. "Wasn't this the camp?" she started, but Ted cut her off. "Come on," he said, taking the sign from her and tossing it in the bushes. "We'll be late." "Can't we take a look?" said Sandra, gazing back down the path, wanting to see what the old place looked like. "No way," said Ted, starting back down the path toward the truck, anxious to get away. Jeff and Sandra exchanged glances and started after him. "What's the problem?" Jeff said. "You don't want to hear about it, man," said Ted. "Believe me, not before lunch." He seemed in a hurry to get back to the truck. Sandra looked at Jeff and shrugged. Ted's mood seemed to have changed very suddenly. It was clear that he didn't want to stay there, and it was just as clear that he didn't want to talk about it. They got back into the truck and started off down the road again. Ted seemed unusually quiet as they drove away. Behind them, a twig cracked on the trail as a heavy work boot stepped on it. The watcher moved some branches aside in order to look after the departing truck. He breathed heavily as old memories surged up within him. They were twisted memories that withered like snakes in his unhinged mind.